This paper examines music for airports and attempts to highlight the album's role in establishing a forum for the use of ambient music in public spaces. It considers the theme of diffusion and the conditions of what an airport provides for us. Brian Eno attempted to create a landscape for background music for it to become more functional, to assume a role, and to fit a purpose. Ultimately, what Eno helped create was a re-evaluation of the role of music and its functionality, helping to diffuse the norm, allowing us to question and reconsider music and its place, if only for a passing moment. At the airport, it's hard to conceive of a space so bound with rules and regulations that is, in essence, transitory. Often these spaces, what seems like part public spheres, are owned and managed either by government or private firms, each implying its own objectivity and onus of the control and regulation of the space in terms of its security, atmosphere, ambience, and experience. In The Politics of the Public Space, Cecil Lowe and Neil Smith define the difference between both public and private space. Public space is traditionally differentiated from private space in terms of its rules of access, the source and nature of control over entry to a space, individual and collective behaviour sanctioned in the specific spaces, and rules of use. The airport is a grounded way station, the most terminally transitional place known to us, between everywhere and nowhere. It is a place made up of on the ways, not there yet, and missed connections. The airport is a place made up of no places, removed, diffused, yet wholly familiar. Christopher Schomburg's The Textual Life of Airports explores the text of these structures whose architecture reveals the stories of the spaces. Schomburg goes on to see that airports not only become increasingly innovative cultural nodes, but they also become places that one could experience and evoke out of context a distinct type of bracketed space. It's hard to imagine the airport as a cultural entity, but they do have cultural histories through architecture and technological advancement. From their origins in the muddy fields of outer suburbia to modern logistical wonders, it's changed our sense of time, distance, and ultimately the ways in which cities are built and how business is done. Environmental psychology discusses the relationship between people and their physical setting. Studies in the area involve the evaluation of the interaction of people's behaviour and the perceptions towards spatial configurations. In Robert Somner's Tight Spaces, Hard Architecture and How to Humanize It, he relates environmental psychology to building design, advocating more flexible spatial configurations in what he termed humanized places. Somner argued, perhaps obviously, that alienating environments produce subtle psychological effects in all of us. He expands on this further in Personal Space, the behavioural basis of design, discussing how much an environment, or any environment for that matter, affects human activities. Man is in quotes, as you can see, because it's very bold. Will adapt to hydrocarbons in the air, detergents in the water, crime in the streets, and crowded recreational areas. Good design becomes a meaningless tautology if we consider that man will be reshaped to fit whatever environment he creates. The long-range question is not how much, so much what sort of environment we want, but what sort of man we want, or woman. Oops. So, outdated as it may seem, Somner's point does raise some attitudes towards the idea of adaptation, key in understanding how we spatially invade our own space and that of others. The conditions of a space allow us to warm to it, to reject it. And these and other considerations in this paper act towards a conceptual model used towards diffusion in music for airports. Situation for an airport traveller is transitory. Similar frameworks exist within the improvised elements of a piece of music. Once they're created, they vanish, leaving only a fleeting sonic image within short-term acoustic memory. These elements swarm in and out of sync, allowing the listener to build auditory situations. These situations occur in physical spaces too, through the ambience of light, design, layout, and character of any given environment. We judge its character on its atmosphere. This sense of situation for recorded music, that is, seems more suited towards private consumption or live performance rather than within the realm of public broadcasting. Light is fundamental to this process. How a space is illuminated, be it natural or unnatural. Light can be defined in a number of different ways through atmosphere, by air, mood, feeling, tone, and character. Situation and light. An airport can and will distort these processes. Technology and engineering provide the conditions for an airport to exist. Marshall McLuhan clarified this thought further in Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man, prescribing that any technology creates a totally new human environment. Environments are not passive wrappings, but active processes. This active process allows us to engage and adapt to new sets of social and environmental conditions. Similarly, Eno helped recast these conditions and presented them to us in a new light, where a sense of location and environment could become, through music, less mundane and more transcendental as an everyday human experience. Background music in a public space often has a polarizing effect. It's often assumed that once forgotten, the music should just merely exist as ambience, the quality or character that remains and defines a space sonically. The opposing effect is that it offers us dislocation or diffusion of the norm, in that it allows us to be transported to a place where the mundane is bypassed and diffused by something that's meditative. The key and the subtle ideas linked to this paper and perhaps the framework of Eno's Music for Airports. In such, it allows for us to present the destruction of the familiar and the removal of the expected. Music for Airports' levels of success are debatable. Indeed, its installation at the Marine Air Terminal in New York's LaGuardia Airport in the 1980s had some staff members complaining about its playback, so much so that it provided more of an annoyance than a complementary sonic aid. Workers are indeed not transitory commuters and are not particularly interested in light or building situations. Clocking out and lunch are more fundamental considerations. Their sense of place is real, fixed, more so than the temporary traveller. In an interview from Harper's and Queen's magazine in 1979, Eno elaborated on not only the sounds he heard in an airport, but also commented on the mechanisms replaying them. I'm such a nervous flyer, I found that this kind of music actually makes you more nervous. I mean, if the sound systems are so bad, and the music is so worthless, you begin to think, well, if this is the standard of music, what must the airplanes be like? In any environment, our situation conditions us, informs us how to operate, helps us understand our habitat. For Eno, it was in this conditioning at Cologne-Bonn Airport during 1977 that the album's concept finally developed towards a concrete idea. Inspired by its decadent use of space and graceful architecture, Eno pondered on the idea of a complementary audio accompaniment. Architecture utilizes many realms of diffusion: the sense of light, sense of place and time. This process of diffusion is created through the aesthetics and ergonomics of architectural design, natural light, and artificial light. The relationship between music and architecture has long been played out. St. Augustine called them sisters, children of the number. Beyond their philosophical relationships, architecture and music have more mutual influences, related to a constructive common denominator, the use of numbers, proportion, and symmetry. All of this is evident, but perhaps it's the dialogue, one that's been going on for centuries, and the more common theme of diffusion that allows the album to become so engaging as a piece of work. Time lag is loosely defined as a period of time between one event and another. Eno dictated this form of time lag in music for airports in the studio, allowing for the sense of pace and movement to evolve. On playback, the pieces on Music for Airports are almost frozen between periods of time. It's like as if the actual sonic events happen and then you slowly begin to notice them. Or perhaps it's the sensation of interruption that's most effective. When played back at half speed on 24-track tape recorder, Eno discovered that the instrument sounded much softer and diffused at this playback speed, thus allowing the movement to become momentarily suspended. The diffusion of time on analog tape, something also in motion, also dictated at a speed, contribute to its sense of space, and is perhaps why very slowly tempered music in an environment where speed and movement, getting to a check-in desk, for example, is innate. It works. It's the opposite in motion. One of the album's key strategies was that the tones were composed and decided on such a way as not to veer into the line with human communication, that is. The tones, in terms of frequency, with both high and low registers, allowing for human speech, somewhere in the ranges of 100 to 8,000 kilohertz, to fit somewhere in between. It's interesting now to see that some airports are adopting a silent approach to the sound diffusion, limiting or restricting the levels of noise pollution, asking the passenger or passengers to become more aware of his or her surroundings, to take more responsibility for their movement. Perhaps this diffusion has now reached towards the decisions we have to make in an airport. The illusion of control and command is slowly and perhaps ultimately slipping away. Perhaps now we have command of the sonic space of an airport. As the airport becomes less polluted with noise, perhaps the two, both music and light, can now coexist and diffuse more harmoniously than ever before, allowing for sound to complement early morning light, cutting into sharp angles by wings and tails of planes, to see through large windows, to awaken the traveller or to awake the traveller from the airport, or perhaps for someone that's just merely passing through, like me at 5 a.m. in Dublin. A tone, phrase, motif, initially made to be small and discrete, can be reimagined into a totally new space within the studio or computer. One final consideration within the loose realm of diffusion is not only how Eno used the recording studio as a compositional tool, but also how spatialization and effects help cast and diffuse soundscapes over landscapes. This, in effect, allowed the musical phrases in Music for Airports to disconnect from reality and help create virtual spaces. Eno discussed this further in Mark Prendergast's The Ambient Century when discussing film soundtracks, in that they help us reimagine worlds, referring to them as music made to support something else, an evocation of a psychological space within something is intended to happen, a sense of music, which presented a climate but left out the action. If film soundtracks were like constructing geography and not populating, the listener, I felt, became the population of a sonic landscape and was free to wander around it. Much like the way in which the inherent design of architecture can help natural light detach and reflect, it exists as reverberations as much like sound reverberations. It allows us to move away from association. The curation of the imaginary sonic landscape helps create mystery and, to some extent, a sense of doubt. Flying by its very nature is a calculated risk, be it a very safe one. Anthony Giddens went on further on this theme in Modernity and Self-Identity, Self-Society in the Late Modern Age, writing that radical doubt filters into most aspects of day-to-day life. Living in a risk culture is inherently unsettling. Part of Music for Airport's power is its creation of sense of doubt and apprehension as to where the music may lead, or what lies above us in the skies ahead. Today we are further detached from our environment and at times unable to gain a sense of place. This, as media scholar Paul Roque discussed, has provided us with an ambivalent calm, proposing a form of provisional comfort that nonetheless registered the presence of external threats. In terms of music and the current access to music we have through streaming in an instant, we can listen to all the recorded music of the world. And if we want, it can transport us to possibly anywhere we want to. The question is to where and to under what conditions. This paper has broadly attempted to speculate to the question of diffusion in relation to music for airports. It's examined the role of the airport as a geographical structure, cast in an environment we know well, but yet constricted through rules and conditions. Music for airports as a piece helps diffuse our expectations of the norm, our sense of location, our surrounding environment, normally conditioned by the ways in which we use the space. Eno helped slow it down, giving us a chance to reimagine time. Ultimately, rather than a sense of resolution, Music for Airports provides to us, musically, a diffused irrolution, an ambivalence that perhaps is central towards the album's aesthetics, adrift and sitting between here and nowhere.